Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Film Studies Online discussion of Oppenheimer. We welcome folks familiar and new to these Bryn Mawr Film Institute offerings. We've done a whole bunch of them, and I have never had a better partner than my partner this evening, Dr. Paul Wright. Paul, how are you?
Good. Thank you, Andrew. Feelings mutual. It's always fun to do these.
It is, and you said in your introduction that you are a Nolan fan, and I must confess I am as well. So we will put our best, critical thinking and appropriate critical distance lenses into our glasses and make the most of all opinions, positive and perhaps somewhat negative. Although those of you who attended last month's discussion of Killers of the Flower Moon know that or should know that I'm a much bigger fan of this movie than I was of that one, for what it's worth.
And of the two, I prefer this one myself as well.
Sounds good. Just a reminder for folks about how things will work tonight. Please keep your audio on mute unless you are asking a question. You will know it is your turn to answer a question or ask your question because I will call on you. I will know to call on you because you will hopefully use the raise hand feature right there within Zoom. At that point, please unmute yourself, ask your question, make your comment, and then please remute yourself while we go about answering. You're also encouraged to introduce yourself or add any comments or say where you're hailing from in the chat function. And you can also talk amongst yourselves in there if you like, and I will be monitoring that to see if there's any topics we want to bring over to the out loud portion of the festivities. I believe with that, we are ready to start. And I see that we have some of our regulars here, including the Glussmans. Glussmans.
So thank you very much. I am back after having been very sorry to miss two in a row. So I am back for probably what I'm going to describe, and I would like to hear both of your response, the shortest 3.5 hour movie I have ever seen. There are comments all over about it being too long and parts that could be cut. While I might be able to figure out a way to agree with some of them, I really don't. I would love to hear the two of you discuss the length, what you think the right length could have been if it's not the right length. I think that there are at least several Oscars that I might throw this way. I know you guys are not really the ultimate Oscar buffs, but I would love to hear your thoughts on the ultimate quality as well as what you think about the odds for Oscars. And the last item for discussion, no matter what review you read, there are some discussions pro or con the sex scenes. I think they served the right purpose. I think they set the scene for the character and how he was thinking, but ultimately the two of you will lead our discussion. Thank you. Andrew, I did not get to see last month's. Janice sat in my stead, but I did understand that it wasn't your favorite movie of the century.
You were you were right about that. It probably wasn't even my favorite movie of the day I saw it, but I don't remember that day. So to get to your questions, my goodness. Well, Paul, would you like to start?
Sure. The length of films has been a big subject this year. I don't know that we necessarily have more epic length films than in the past. It may be the case, but it sure seems to be a subject of discussion. And I've had friends who didn't care for Oppenheimer or Killers of the Flower Moon or Napoleon, and not on the basis of the content of those films, but just an annoyance at how long they were. And I'm just acknowledging that. I am very much on the opposite side of that divide. I am a huge fan of long films when they're done right. Not every film justifies its length, but I think the comments so far that this is the shortest 3.5 hour movie you could ask for, I think that's pretty spot on. And it's always a question for me, does the story, does the execution of the story by the director, cast, et cetera, does it merit the length? And what is lost and what is gained by going at that length? And I think this is a film I could have continued to watch. If Nolan had wanted to make it longer, I probably would have been just fine with that. Before I forget it, you did mention the sex scenes. There was a moment where I wondered, if really the scene where Oppenheimer does the famous quotes right from Sanskrit. Now I'm become death, destroyer of worlds. First time we hear that, right? It's in the middle of the sex scene with Jean Tarlock, played by Florence Pugh. And I was a little bit about the execution there, but for the most part, I had no problem with it. I know it was a source of some concern in countries where sexuality is more censored, at least in the Hollywood product. And because of the sex scene also coinciding with the Bhagavad Gita quote, there were some people in India who were troubled on a different level by that choice. But interestingly, I read that a number of things were cut in the Indian distribution of the film, but that scene was actually left in, and you would think that would have courted the most controversy. But back to the length, Andrew, any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I mean, I've watched movies that are 2 hours long that are too long. And I've watched movies like this that I thought, I would, if the story is going to keep being told this way, I think I'd be happy to sit for a little longer. Um, it really has to do not just with the subject matter and not just with the skills of the actors or particular people involved in the production, but a lot of it has to do with the structure. And something that Nolan is, I would say, very good at, but what everyone would have to agree is at least very interested in exploring, utilizing, trying to make use of, is structure. And I think the structure of this film warrants and probably even necessitates that that runtime. And I could see one response to that being, well, part of the reason the structure necessitates that is you see things twice. And that's true, you do see things twice, sometimes more than twice, but the perspective has changed or the context has changed. You understand now where it falls in a trajectory that you didn't understand before. And so in that regard, I think it works, and I don't find the length to be a hindrance or a problem. Regarding the sex scenes, I found them surprising and off-putting. I don't know if it's because I don't think, I'm used to movies from the 40s where you don't see such things, not a movie made today set in the 40s. I also don't know if it's because, I tend not to think of these sort of historical figures as engaging in those things. But at the end of the day, I have to, I think I have to come down on the side of it was appropriate to include it, if only because it sounds like philandering was a big part of how Oppenheimer spent his time. And it sounds like he really had an appetite in that regard. And I think that is, I also think it's important because part of the point, I mean, if we're going to boil down this movie to one sentence that anybody would understand, I think one way to do that would be, how could someone be so smart and so dumb, at once? How could the same person be among the smartest who ever lived and seemingly lack basic a basic understanding of human behavior. And I think the various liaisons depicted in the film are important in establishing that element as well. And so at the end of the day, and I don't think they're supposed to be, I think they're supposed to be as, I don't think they're supposed to be, you know, titillating. I think they're supposed to be revealing in the character and human sense. And I think you see that from the way they're shot and implemented.
I just wanted to build quickly on something you said there, Andrew, and I think it's a good distinction you're making. I don't have any problem with the sex scenes per se, in the sense that Oppenheimer's frailties, you know, as a person, as a husband, etc., they're definitely part of his tale. And I think to gloss over them or exclude them would have been a mistake. I think what was a little jarring to me is that that's the platform for the, you know, the famous "now I'm become death" moment. But I think there was a way in which that was meant to capture Oppenheimer's fascination, or even to some degree fixation, with Jean Tatlock, the Florence Pugh character, because she was someone he was very bound up with, but didn't want to marry him. They got close, but it never happened. He ended up marrying someone else. But she was an incredibly powerful presence in his life, as the film indicates. And in fact, it's suggested in American Prometheus, the book on which the film is based, that Jean may have been the inspiration for calling it Trinity in the first place, because she was a huge fan of John Donne. And one of Donne's great poems is about the Trinity: "Batter my heart, O three-person God," which I think is a line that Oppenheimer has in the movie as well. So I think in terms of honoring the intensity of that relationship and its impact on him, I think that scene makes a lot more sense the more I think about it.
Gus, what's on your mind?
Okay. Yeah, it looks like Nolan in his films is very interested in science as at least you know, a launching point for a lot of what he does. I mean, you think of Interstellar, you think of even something like Memento has at least a medical basis. And I was just wondering what both of you thought about, well, how does this film fit in possibly? Do you come up with like a kind of viewpoint that Nolan has about science? I mean, you know, he seems to use it and then use it for his own purposes, but I'm not exactly sure if there's a connecting theme through all of these.
Paul, would you like to go first?
Sure. I hesitate to say that Nolan has a defined ethos when it comes to science. He's certainly interested in the power and potential of science, either in a science fiction vein or in this real life vein. But one thing I think I stressed in the intro video, which I did some time ago, so I honestly don't remember it too well. I don't remember my own movie. But one of the things I think I said was that Nolan's movies are all about unintended consequences and things getting out of your grasp in a hurry, regardless of your good intentions or not so good intentions. So whether it's, you know, a sci-fi film like Interstellar, or a time travel puzzler like Tenet, or even The Dark Knight, it always seems that you play with Pandora's box, you open Pandora's box at your own risk. And maybe that's the consistent message in Nolan movies, at least the way I take them, and certainly an explicit, you know, message of this film. Right by the end of the movie, we get to hear the conversation that Einstein and Oppenheimer had, which is invented for the purposes of the film, but it sure is a plausible one. Right, the notion that we've set in motion things that can't be taken back.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think he's interested in the sort of porous barrier between the rational and the emotional, and how people often seek out rational, whether it's medical or scientific things, because of some emotional need, or they consider themselves or find themselves in a world governed by the rational and are thoroughly confused when the irrational or the emotional or the human comes into it. I mean, I think about The Prestige. I think about Inception. Certainly, I think Memento, where, this condition, this is what this means, and this is how it should function. But there's humans involved, so it doesn't quite. And that certainly works here. So I think that, I think unintended consequences is a huge theme of his movies. I also think he likes to see how humans act and in some cases find their ways out of crucibles that are built by sort of rational, a crucible of a rational box that this is how this should go. And the rules of science or of magic, or magic as a stage show, not actual, if there is actual magic, what have you, this condition in Memento, the way criminals and police and so aren't supposed to act, that what happens when they don't, and what happens here when, in this case, it's not the machine, right? The machine works as they expect it to. It's the people that don't work as expected, or the situation changes and assumptions were made that should not have been. And so I think I can definitely see this being of a piece of his other work. I think it's going to take more time and a better mind than mine to probably articulate it more comprehensively, but I think there's something there. Joss, you have a question.
A couple of comments and ask you to engage in some discussion regarding the Oppenheimer's sexuality. I think that was one manifestation of a greater or broader hedonistic way of life for him. I was inspired by the movie to read American Prometheus, and it was clear that he enjoyed his pleasures. He wasn't an alcoholic, but he was a heavy drinker. He smoked constantly. He loved the finer things. He chose the site for Los Alamos because he loved that part of the country and had family residence there. And I think it was all a part of that. And I think the movie was long enough without getting into all of that. The other thing I wanted to ask you to discuss maybe a little bit more was the Nolan's use of time, not just in this film, but in many of his films going back as far as Memento, which played in reverse time, and Interstellar, which compressed and expanded time, as did Inception, and Tenet, which just twisted time in all sorts of directions that I couldn't keep up with. But all with a purpose. And I just wondered if you had any more thoughts about that or would elaborate on that a bit.
Paul?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's another recurring theme and narrative device for Nolan is the pliability of time. I think what this film gets into is the intensity of the ways in which we remember time, in which we remember what happened to us. And one of the things I found interesting in researching the film and buying the screenplay, actually, is that Nolan wrote the screenplay in the first person. So even when he was gestating the narrative before a single frame was shot, he already imagined this story to be primarily through the lens of Oppenheimer's consciousness. And so all those wonderful moments, to me wonderful, where he is envisioning the deep structures of the universe, the deep structures of the atom, quantum mechanics, you name it, and those moments when he's reflecting on the potential of nuclear weapons to bring about a Holocaust. All those moments are subjective for Oppenheimer, and they become our moments. So it's a film that, in a sense, teaches you to see the world to some degree the way he saw it, for better and worse. There's a contrast, of course, to the scenes that are in black and white. When he switches to black and white, we're in a much darker, literally darker moment of Oppenheimer's life, right? He is under siege. That investigation of him is happening. His security clearance is going to be revoked. The Strauss character is working behind the scenes to destroy him. And so all those black and white scenes are recalled in their own way, right, as a kind of torment. And as problematic as the implications of Oppenheimer's scientific work may be, all those color scenes reflect a time of great energy and great commitment and a sense of purpose. It may turn out to be a dark purpose, but it is a sense of purpose. So I think this film really is interested in the subjectivity of how we experience time and how we experience our own lives.
Yeah, I mean, time for most people in most settings is the most rational, least forgiving, most immutable part of any endeavor, right? And when, I mean, stories about time travel have been not just in the movies, but across media have been of great interest for, you know, for centuries. And there's a reason why that is. And I think it's the reason that so many of Nolan's films deal with it, which is that it can be this unbelievable obstacle. It can be this unbelievable opportunity. And if you can somehow learn to think of it differently as an Oppenheimer or Interstellar, or master it somehow, expand it at will, as in Inception, then all sorts of possibilities open up, possibilities that are the sorts of things that the industrious, creative, and some would say obsessed Nolan protagonist is interested in exploring. I want to mention something. Ron in the chat talked about time having, he says, I wonder if there's another theme, a positive one, the ability of people to unite in a common purpose under time pressure to achieve the quote impossible, as exemplified in Oppenheimer and Dunkirk. I think that's absolutely true. Nolan does have, positive films. He does have positive messages. He does have people who overcome the obstacles. And that's a wonderful wonderful example of how he is someone survives the crucible, or arguably even thrives under the crucible, right? I mean, without the limit of time, would Oppenheimer or Groves or whoever had the commitment to bring everyone together, literally in the middle of nowhere, so they had nothing to do but to work together on that. And I think that's what the film, that's one of the strengths of the film, and one of the things that I think this movie doesn't play with as much overtly as some of the others, but I think it's there sort of implicitly.
There's one thing I wanted to add, and it was a passage I was going to bring up anyway, about time. in this case, the effect of the atomic age on our sense of time. And this is from E.L. Doctorow, as quoted by Kai Bird. Kai Bird's one of the co-authors of American Prometheus. E.L. Doctorow, you might remember, right? Great novelist, wrote Ragtime, Billy Bathgate, some things that have even been adapted to film. And this was a number of years back, right? So Doctorow said, we have had the bomb on our minds since 1945. It was first our weaponry and then our diplomacy, and now it's our economy. How can we suppose that something so monstrously powerful would not, after all these years, compose our identity? The great golem we have made against our enemies is our culture, our bomb culture, its logic, its faith, its vision, which I think just captures so well the larger interests of the film, right? Even beyond your conventional biopic.
Thanks for sharing that, Paul. Next up, we have the Hirsches, Barbara and Richard.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks for giving us an opportunity. I thought this was an extraordinary film, and one of the reasons I thought so is that at the time that I saw it, I was most of the way through the book. And it's such a, I think, an extraordinary book, an extraordinary story. And as I was watching it, and I think Richard's experience bore this out, he had not read the book, is that there were so many characters. And because of the time shifting back and forth, I thought if I had not read the book, I might have had much more trouble following it. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the adaptation of such a detailed story like this to the screen, and the kinds of choices that get made to make it such a wonderful feat, because it really was such a detailed book, and I thought that it was very effectively transferred to the screen.
I would agree with that. Every once in a while, I teach courses on adaptation from various media, from one to the other, not always just book to film, but book to film is a great example. And I read American Prometheus in between my first and second viewing. So like you, my first viewing, I didn't know a lot of the players. I was a little lost, but then I made a point of reading the book, which I don't think is necessary to appreciate the film, but it helps, it adds to it. And I was really impressed with this as an adaptation. I think it's one of the best adaptations I've seen on screen, in part because Nolan, I think, was smart enough, even though he has a long runtime, he knew he was never going to capture everything in that book. There's no way. So you have to be selective. You have to pick and choose. You have to find your points of emphasis. You have to cover a lot of ground with a lot of personalities, historical personalities that were important to this tale, but you can't give any one of them too much time, because at the end of the day, it's Oppenheimer's movie. And I think Nolan was really judicious in how he did that. I will give one example of something that no one's quite sure really happened, the way it's talked about in print or the way it's shown to us on screen, and that is Oppenheimer attempting to poison his tutor at Cambridge. I think it was Cambridge. That is a very dramatic moment in the film early on. It kind of shows you his loneliness at that point. It shows you his ambition to a certain degree, his frustration with being put into a box by, superiors like that tutor. And it showed you that he was a bit unstable, right? Because he even thought to execute this. There's a lot of dispute about whether that ever really happened. There is no evidence of disciplinary action taken, which Oppenheimer claimed had been taken, and that his punishment was to be sent to a psychiatrist. So we're not sure if that happened or if it's all in Oppenheimer's mind. But this film is so subjective in many ways anyway, right? I just talked about this earlier, right? We understand the events through the lens of Oppenheimer's incredible mind, right? But we're also going to see him at his most petty, at his most desperate. And so I think in a certain way, it doesn't really matter whether or not it really happened or happened in exactly that way. One theory is that he did try it, but that he only put something to make the tutor sick, not to kill him. But in the film, it's pretty clear that he would be killed by the substance chosen. And we see that Niels Bohr, played by Kenneth Branagh, might have accidentally bitten into that apple himself. None of that apparently happened in the way we're shown in the film. So that's an example of the dramatic license a director will take. But I think it was in service of character. And so I'm, at the end of the day, okay with that. But I've not read many critiques of the film for being inaccurate. I mean, not that it's perfectly accurate, but that by and large, it really honors the source material. At least, you know, Bird and is it Martin's account of Oppenheimer's life.
Some of you have heard me say this before, but a novel is not the appropriate written form to turn into a feature film. A short story is. A novel or a biography of enormous size, like this one, or like Killers of the Flower Moon, for example, you have a tremendous amount of work to do, and you have a tremendous amount of very difficult work to do. In some cases, so much difficult work that you would be better off not trying to shoehorn the enormous work into a single feature film. I think what the smartest the smartest approach is to try to be faithful in spirit, in theme, in character, and to whatever through line of the multiple possible iterations of a dramatic arc you choose, to be faithful to how that is presented. And that is the best you can hope for. And frankly, those are the instances I recall where I don't read a lot of fiction, so I very often hear what other people who've read the book think of a film I've seen. And typically when that happens, you know, the ones where the people who read the book are the most satisfied or the least dissatisfied adhere to those sorts of guidelines. They say, you know, there's a lot of stuff not in there, but they really got it. And I think I think that's the best you can hope for, and that's the best to strive for. And it makes sense because they're different forms, right? They're different ways to tell a story. They present different opportunities, and there are often ways in film to present things or work things in that don't take up narrative time that in a book necessarily take up many, many pages. There could be a whole character who, you know, has chapters dedicated to his or her life. And in a film, you see that character in a supporting capacity, but get the core of their character as they interact with the protagonist. And that's serving theme and character and the sort of the arc of the story. And I think that's the best that people can hope for. And I think it's why filmmakers are typically drawn to a novel. It's sometimes, sure, I imagine it's, oh, there's this scene and I would love that, or there's this dialogue, there's this monologue the character has and I'd love to, you know, film an actor saying that. But I think most of the time this is the central conflict, or this is the theme it deals with, or this is the existential question it posits. And so when that's presented in a way that the filmmaker finds intriguing, they want to take that and run with it. And they chose the source material, so there's something about it that they appreciate. So they're not trying to undo it; they're trying to do it, but in the medium that they're working in. Let's see, Dana, welcome in.
Hi there. Hi. Okay, I'm changing direction here. And it's about the acting for me, as you might have imagined. So how do I want to start here? Well, I want to start by saying I loved loved Marlon Brando. I thought he was wonderful on the screen. And I could have been a contender. But times they have changed. And there was some acting in this movie that shows us that film acting has really, really come a long way. So Cillian Murphy, I want to leave him to the end because he's perplexing. The first one, though, that I want to talk about is my dear Iron Man, Tony Stark, Robert Downey Jr. I mean, I thought he just inhabited that character in a frightening way. I didn't know where that character was going to go. I didn't know he was going to be such a villain at the end. How dare they make Robert Downey Jr. a villain like that anyway? And I just bought everything he did, the nuances he brought to it. I read about this Strauss guy, and on Wikipedia, and he brought some things into the character that are really part of that person, from what I could read. I just thought his performance was amazing. I also loved seeing Gary Oldman. I'm thinking, Truman, who is that? Oh, it's Gary Oldman. I mean, when he turned around and said at the end of the moments with Oppenheimer, get that crybaby out of here, I thought, oh, that's this wonderful Gary Oldman. Rami Malek, I just couldn't even believe he played that character. And he was so winning. I mean, he's come such a long way from, Freddie Mercury. It's just the casting was amazing. The way they portrayed these people were amazing. There was something wonderful about seeing old friends' faces in these parts, and yet realizing that they just immerse themselves so completely in these characters. I just couldn't get over it. Emily Blunt, I thought was amazing. Okay, so Cillian Murphy, I don't want to talk forever. He was so, I don't know. You talked, Paul, in your introduction about him. I'm sure he's going to be nominated for an Oscar, and I'm sure he may win. And I don't know what to make of him. His appearance is so much a part of who he is. His eyes and his demeanor and that sort of androgynous way about him, and how not Jewish he seemed, particularly surrounded by all these other characters who were. So I was utterly intrigued by him. And I will also say I was utterly intrigued by his hat, which is the best hat I've seen since Indiana Jones. Really, I mean, that the way that hat, and that's what the hat looked like that the guy actually wore. I mean, but it was just such a great prop thing. It was such a great, the way it flapped around in the wind, and he wore it all the time. And he was the only one in a hat in the era where men wore hats. There were just such wonderful, wonderful character things here. Such a feast for, of a film in so many ways, but acting, you cannot sell the acting short here. And I certainly hope these people get recognized, most especially Robert Downey Jr. I just couldn't get over him. So there you have my take.
Thanks, Dana.
Thanks, Dana. I'm sorry, Paul, go ahead.
Oh, you want to go?
No, go ahead.
I appreciate the reflection on all the terrific performances in the film. I think ultimately that's what makes it work. I mean, as visually engaging as it is, the sound design, special effects, you name it, I knew that would all work. I trusted Nolan with that. But getting the right cast together and getting them to have the chemistry they need is just so essential. And sometimes you can have the best names on paper and that chemistry is just not there. Or maybe it was there, but it didn't make it to the editing room. But in this film, it made it all the way. And I agree, Downey's performance was, to me, kind of a revelation. And I think a very conscious reminder on his part that I'm not just Iron Man. I can still do really serious, dramatic stuff. I haven't lost a step. In fact, I think he's gained steps over the years. And he really inhabited that role. And I agree with you. The more I dug into the real life of Strauss, the more impressed I was with Downey's ability to channel that. The Rami Malek, I also appreciated. He only has this one really important moment in the film, right, where he comes to Oppenheimer's defense, in essence, in the Strauss hearings. And I was so glad to see him utilized in a way that wasn't just, oh, there's Rami Malek. And initially I was afraid that's what was happening, because he shows up as a guy that Oppenheimer scolds for some minor thing, and you don't think there's going to be anything more of his character, or if he is going to come back, he might come back vindictively rather than defending Oppenheimer. And in this kind of production where everybody wants to be in your movie, it can go in a lot of ways, right? Like you can go and do a performance and your performance ends up on the cutting room floor, or the virtual equivalent of that these days. The great example in my mind of that is not Rami Malek, but Terrence Malick in The Thin Red Line. There were lots of performers in that movie who were kind of shocked how little they were in it when the final product was released. And I love that film, but you can tell there were a lot of performances that just didn't make it to the end. And I'm glad that Malick was not just a throwaway. I would also not want to forget Matt Damon. Matt Damon carried himself and was costumed and had a body language that made him feel like he was in a 40s or 50s film to me. I really appreciated how he played Groves. I think Paul Newman had done it before. And I like Paul Newman. I love Paul Newman. But I think Matt Damon really owned the part. And I won't say more about Murphy. I think plenty can be said. He taught me he could be a perfect brooder, a brooding soul in Peaky Blinders, as well as a host of other things. He's just extraordinary. Andrew?
No, I wasn't. I considered Matt Damon the weak link of this. Maybe
Really?
it's because I saw Paul Newman in the part. Maybe it's because Matt Damon just never seems like a grown up to me. He always seems like someone who got their dad's old war uniform out of the closet and found a fake mustache and put it on. But I consider him the weak link of a number of things, not everything, but a number of things he's in, and I thought that was the case here, but not to. He doesn't sink the film, but I think it's fortunate that the character is depicted as a rather terse and blunt person, because I think that means less screen time and fewer words, and that worked well for me. The Paul Newman movie, it's a Fat Man and a Little Boy. It was made in the late 80s or early 90s, and it's a different approach, but it's basically Los Alamos, but much sort of more conventional dramatic and less menacing dramatic, I guess is the way to say it. But it has a very interesting cast, but Paul Newman plays Leslie Groves in that. And the guy who played Howling Mad Murdoch on the A-Team plays Oppenheimer. So if that's not a selling point, then I don't know what is.
Dwight Schultz.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, Michael Cassidy, you're up. Okay, we can come back to Michael. Douglas, are you there?
I'm here.
Great, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. Somebody said that Cillian Murphy didn't look Jewish, which I think probably pretty good, since Robert Oppenheimer, who was Jewish, didn't really go out of his way to portray himself as such as he went through his life. So maybe that was a bit of good casting. My question is a little different. I think the movie was first aired in this area on a Thursday. I saw the movie that day. I went to a party on Saturday, 2 days later. And there was not a big party, about 16 people, I think. And unusual for this time, this era, there were a bunch of liberals at the party and a bunch of conservatives. And a liberal, other than myself, asked, "Hey, has anybody seen Oppenheimer?" And the movie was heavily publicized on television before it came out. And myself and a few other people who I identify as liberals excitedly started a conversation, and several conservative people didn't even know the movie existed, let alone having seen it. So my question is this: do you have any information? First, how many people saw the film, or what was the gross in the United States, and whether there's any demographic breakdown? Is this all big city, not rural? Is there any sort of indication? Do film audiences get analyzed like that?
They don't typically get analyzed that way. They would be analyzed geographically, more or less. But I think that it's fair to say that when a movie makes $325 million domestically, it isn't just playing to one demographic. And I would also say that I saw it at the IMAX at King of Prussia, one of the 20 odd places in the world showing it on 70 millimeter IMAX film. And that theater was definitely a mixture. If you, to the extent that you can look at people or hear people and make those assessments, it was definitely a mixture of people. I would also say that as a Christopher Nolan film, and frankly, as a film with $100 million budget, this movie was going to be marketed to everyone. And I remember seeing ads that made the movie seem far more action driven than it was, or event driven than it was, showing up on all sorts of programs. So, I think it makes sense that in the week a movie opens or very early on, people who are more likely, based on what you're saying, to read the New York Times or the Washington Post, to watch CBS Sunday Morning, to listen to NPR, to perhaps look at what's on the New York Times bestseller list, or actually read or listen to those books. It makes sense that they would be aware of the film at the beginning, but it would not have been too long before, if that party happened a week or two later, they all would have heard of it, I think.
Yeah, just to build on what Andrew's saying, there probably is data that we don't have access to in terms of the demographic deep dive on who attended, although it's hard to know that, right, with certainty, but I'm sure a data scientist could dig into that more. What I think the film did benefit from, ironically enough, was the other film that could have jeopardized its success, and that's Barbie. Right, that whole Barbieheimer phenomenon that resulted in a lot of people seeing both movies that opening weekend, many on the very same day. I think that did both movies a huge favor. And I think it expanded the demographic reach of both movies. Now, what you said that I found really interesting in terms of the politics of people's response to the film or potential interest in seeing it, it's hard for me to comment on the political divide per se, but one thing I do think this film does very successfully is I don't think it really takes a side ultimately on the necessity of the use of that weapon. I think it lives in that moral gray area, that ambivalent place that Oppenheimer lived in, where on the one hand, you fully understand the urgency of defeating the Axis powers, right? And that something has to be done, right? You can't sit by and do nothing, or worse, let the Axis have a weapon of this magnitude. By the same token, the film also entertains that this may be one of the most disastrous steps the species has ever taken. And a lot of films would have been more tempted to lean heavily in one direction or another. And a lot of films would have tried to maybe have it both ways and end up doing nothing of interest. But I think this film actually leans into the ambivalence that I think is quite rational when you look at the reality of that conflict, what the world was facing, but also the Pandora's box we opened in our response to that crisis. So maybe that's not a political divide that's easily categorized as liberal and conservative, but I do think it certainly is the tension in myself. When I think about those times, I think about this moment, I think about that weapon, and I really appreciated the film speaking to that and letting us live in that, because nobody lived it more than Oppenheimer.
I appreciate both of your responses. There is another political axis that I see in the movie, and that is the McCarthy era. Separate and apart from issues being ushered into the atomic age, is where do you come down on communism? Robert Oppenheimer, in my opinion, a Jew, was the single largest casualty of the McCarthy era, bar none. And the movie didn't quite, in my opinion, depict how shattered he was by this whole series of events. And I think that might be the divide that I felt sensitive to.
You know what I liked, to your point, I really liked the film showing how many people in their young adult years or middle years before the war, how many of them gravitated towards causes of all kinds, including leftist causes, maybe even communist causes, but how varied their experiences of those causes were, how varied their commitments actually ended up being, and how much the McCarthy era then tried to, in a Manichaean way, make it a very black and white, or in this case, red, white, and blue versus red kind of question. When the reality is, as Oppenheimer's wife, played by Emily Blunt, points out, right? The reality is that there were all kinds of groups and causes that these young people were interested in, but it didn't make them traitors to the country. It didn't make them dyed-in-the-wool communist agents. It's not that there may not have been some people like that. Sure, there were. But this willingness to go on the witch hunt, even for people's dalliances in their youth with different causes and ideologies, really showed the darkness of those times. I appreciate your comment, because I think that is another thread in the film.
I think I would also just add that I think a lot of us who are either older or more politically engaged or aware, or you might say informed than the average moviegoer, tend to look at things through a lens that lots of other people don't look through it. Don't look through. I also think that it's probably the case that we couldn't map the Manhattan Project onto today's axis of left and right if we wanted to. I was reminded that how much I am different from the average person in their 20s who goes out and protests for this cause or that cause, which is something that I don't do, but does so while sometimes woefully uninformed by reading in the Wall Street Journal about how few of the people on college campuses chanting from the river to the sea know what river and what sea and what that means. And when told what river and what sea and what that means, no longer support the message. So I think that, if that straw poll you took at that gathering tells us anything, it might just be who's aware of and interested in American history from 80 years ago and who isn't. And that might be it. Not that that's, an admirable quality to not be interested in the history, but I think that's probably the biggest thing it would indicate. Let's see, Michael, are you able to come through now?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead, please.
All right, I had two things to say regarding Oppenheimer. One is something we were talking about earlier, and that is the financial success of the movie. Now, if you want to hear about an absolute madhouse, be at KOP IMAX in its second weekend. Concession lines to the door, they literally ran out of popcorn buckets, so they just gave me a Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves bucket. which I think is really good for theaters. I would imagine that all of us here being, in the Bryn Mawr Film Institute discussion group are probably people who are the way theaters have been going, given how poorly most movies have been doing financially. I think it's really great that Oppenheimer did so well, which, a lot of it was owed to the success of the Barbenheimer phenomena, but it is a great movie in its own right, and Nolan is probably the one director who's financially successful in this age when even people like Spielberg can have crank out great movies and they end up doing horribly at the box office. I think Oppenheimer making as much money as it did is really good because this is the type of movie that could very well have bombed under other circumstances. No pun intended, of course. And then we would be sitting around here complaining like, everyone says they want to see these great new non-franchise movies, and there it is. And, so that's pretty good. $950 million in total. Never would I have guessed it would have even come close to that. Then something I wanted to say regarding the film itself is what doesn't show up in the movie, and that is you don't actually see the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which when I saw that the movie was rated R, which for Nolan, that's exceptionally rare. He hasn't made an R-rated film since Memento, and that came out 20 years ago. My first guess was, he just has like this really graphic scene where you see like thousands of innocent people die in Hiroshima. Well, we know now it's mostly owed to Oppenheimer's philandering. But I like that he doesn't include the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki because, we know now what happened. We can look it up online and just see, what little footage exists of it. But for Oppenheimer, it's this sort of intellectual knowledge. My creation killed hundreds of thousands of people, even if it's not something that he can see. He himself is totally disconnected from everyone who suffered as a result of the creation of the bomb. And yet that doesn't detract from the weight of it. It doesn't detract from the weight that it puts on his shoulders, knowing that all these innocent people died because of him. He doesn't need to see them to know who they are. And that is something I think the film does very well.
So,
well, thank you. Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, this one's kind of near and dear to me for reasons that will be clear in a minute. I take your point about the film's choice not to depict the actual bombings. First of all, Oppenheimer wasn't there for the bombings, right? So in a film that's so dedicated to his subjectivity, I think it would not have rung true to just show the bombings. That said, and here's one of my quibbles with the film, there is a scene where Oppenheimer is seeing footage of the aftermath of the bombings, but he only watches the screen and we watch him and we don't see that footage. Personally, I think that footage should have been there in that moment because I want to see what he saw. I want to see what I've seen in my own research. Because that really forces us to confront the moral dilemma of the entire film. And I still think the film does that beautifully. I love the film. But that was the one moment irked me, I have to say. And I say it's near and dear to me because I lived in Japan for 4 years. And I watched a lot of movies in Japan in those 4 years, Japanese movies, Hollywood movies, you name it. And it is typical for American films to be delayed. Like we had to wait forever to see LA Confidential. I think I waited a year to see that movie in Japan. I had seen it in the States on a holiday trip, but I couldn't see it again until it finally showed up in Japan. I was there teaching for that 4-year period. So Oppenheimer, like these other films, is going to be delayed. I hear it's going to come out next year finally in Japan. But can you imagine the delicacy of that marketing campaign and the delicacy of how that audience will experience the film? I'm dying to ask my Japanese friends what they make of it And while the film certainly reminds us that we are the only nation to drop these weapons in anger, we should not lose sight that they're the only nation to have experienced those weapons dropped in anger. And it is, to me, important that at some moment that carnage be acknowledged. And I felt that was the one false step in the film. Although I could see an argument for it in the sense that Oppenheimer doesn't want to look at it too closely either, right? He's already feeling the weight of what he's wrought. And so maybe he just can't process those images right now. But I feel like we as the audience should have been forced to process those images. Just my opinion.
I would say that I think not showing those scenes fits with the film. It fits with the film's approach to storytelling. It fits to the film's and the film's absence, by and large, of sentiment. The film's one of the film's points, I think, is that the main character doesn't understand sentiment, and you know, he knows rationally what will happen. That if we are to believe the characterization in the film, he is envisioning, or is capable of envisioning, what happens to people exposed to those things, before he, within the story, sees that footage. I think that I think it would have been a wrong note, and it would not have helped the exploration of the themes that Nolan is striving for. You can't. It's that distance from that actual on the ground of that incident is part of Oppenheimer's character. It's why he doesn't share the sentiments of the people in the project who think they should have a greater say over what happens to it. It's probably what allowed him to embark on the endeavor in the first place to some extent. And so when people he respected were warning him not to. So I understand it. And I also think that, you know, I have a bit of respect for Nolan. I can imagine that, you know, that he knew that would be expected, and he knew that there would be criticism for not doing it, but he didn't.
So Andrew, I have to push back just a little. I really, what you're saying about it fitting the film Nolan's trying to make and the characterization of Oppenheimer that they're striving for. And in that context, I think it's the right move, perhaps, but it's the right move for an American audience. I think, you know, a Japanese audience will receive that omission in a very, very different way. They will be the ones. I already have a friend who's chomping at the bit to watch this movie, a Japanese friend. We've been friends for 40 years now. And I guarantee you that's going to be one of the first things he says to me. So it's always a matter of audience too, right? And I'm not saying every film is going to please every audience, but there is a high bar, I think, for this film to be well received in Japan. As filmmaking, I know it'll be well received because Japanese audiences love Nolan in general, but I wonder in particular how this film will come off, because in that moment, and maybe it's just me with my baggage and my background and my time in Japan, maybe it's that simple, but for me in that moment, I said, all you did was shield an American audience from the reality of what the weapon did. Now, I know we all know in the abstract what it did, but it's important to see it, to me. But, you know, everyone will have their own opinion on this.
I mean, I remember as a kid going to the United Nations building in New York and seeing an exhibit of artifacts from the sites and being struck by, in the film, they talk about the fabric being burned on, the pattern of the fabric being burned onto people and things like that, and seeing evidence of things like that. And so, you know, I'm sure you're absolutely right. I don't think it's, you know, I think that if you want to show, if they're showing that movie in Japan, that all the criticism he's going to get is fair game, absolutely. But I think to ask someone to make a film for so many cultures, particularly one that presumably isn't his own and he's not very familiar with, I think that's a really tall order. I think you have to take, you have to handle what's thrown at you. But I think being expected to do that, I have no doubt. I wasn't thinking of it in those terms because those terms aren't my terms, but you're absolutely right. There's a lot of things, and I'm sure someone who, and there aren't very many left, but I'm sure someone who's a veteran of the Pacific might have a very different view of the film as well. So,
Yeah.
So those things are as they are. I have been asked to recommend the documentary Day After Trinity, which gives a more, I guess, a bit more extensive account of Oppenheimer's life after the sort of the last hour of that film, but after the sort of uh, the bombing actually occurs, or at least the testing occurs. Let me see. Gus, did you have another question or comment? No, you did not.
Sorry
Oh, you
about
did.
that.
That's okay.
I lowered. I should have lowered my hand, but so go on. Sorry.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Well, we don't have any other questions, so it appears that we are all done for the evening. Thank everyone very much for joining us for this discussion. I think I can safely speak for Paul when I say we were really looking forward to this one for months since we put it on the calendar, and there were a lot of wonderful points and issues raised, and we certainly appreciate it. We hope you all got something out of it as well. We will announce our next session in an upcoming education email. That will be, those come out on Thursdays. So if you get Bryn Mawr Film Institute emails, you'll find out about our next session. But until then, you can get a online copy of the new issue of Projections, which has all of the films and special programs and courses and seminars coming up in the next quarter, including one taught by our very own Paul Wright on the fascinating, and I know for fans of it, very enjoyable television series Better Call Saul. So check that out. Check out all the other education offerings, and certainly please come to the theater. It's a great time of year to see movies. We've got a lot of great movies that are out, and there's no better way to see them than on the big screen, and there's no better crowd to see them with than your friends and neighbors from the greater mainline area. There's no better place to see them than Bryn Mawr Film Institute. I also want to say it's that time of year when, like all nonprofits, we are trying to raise money during this time of goodwill. We have our annual appeal going on, our Shining Stars annual appeal. If you like what we do and you like having a community nonprofit art house film center housed in a historic, nearly 100-year-old theater building in your community, consider making a donation. We appreciate them big and small. And if you straight up donation isn't in the cards, perhaps a membership will be if you are not currently a member at the nonprofit Bryn Mawr Film Institute. Thanks very much, everybody. We look forward to seeing you for our next discussion, which should be announced in Thursday's education email. And Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And for your wonderful points on the film and your very eye-opening introduction as well. And we will look forward to seeing you all at Bryn Mawr Film Institute soon. Until then, enjoy the holiday season.